You are very warmly welcome to this workshop, and it's very nice to see so many of you here today spending your Friday. This is part of a series of workshops, and I will also show you the next episodes of the series, but I would like to first start by telling what's actually the project that is behind this series of workshops. Let me share my slides. So I would like to introduce a little bit the project, where we come from. We have a project that is actually, we call it DIGHT-Net. It's about enhancing research capacity in digital cultural heritage. The actual title of the project is Sustainable, Usable and Visible Digital Cultural Heritage, Twinning for Excellence. And this is an EU Horizon funded project. It started at the end of the last year, 2024, and we will continue up to 2027. And this is part of a particular form of funding, so-called twinning funding, and the aim is to increase capacity in one of the partner universities, and then the other universities are supporting that development. So this is a cooperation of 4 universities: Tallinn University, University of Amsterdam, Bologna and Turku. And the PI of the whole consortium is Marek Tam, the professor of cultural history at Tallinn University. He will join us a bit later today. And Marek is guiding the whole project. And the aim is to help Tallinn to concentrate on digital cultural heritage studies and support that development. And then we have other partners that are working together with Tallinn. So that's the main composition of the project. Well, there are other twins in the center of the project. Actually, this is very much based on 2 leading figures in the humanities or in the history of humanities, namely Juri Lotman, the famous semiotician and cultural theorist that was based in Estonia. And Tallinn University today holds a substantial collection of Lotman's archives, and you will hear about that also in today's session. And then Umberto Eco, who also has a substantial collection that helps us to understand the development of humanities in the 20th century. And Bologna is involved in our project, and University of Bologna actually holds the collections of Umberto Eco. So the original idea that Marek had was to try to bring these major figures together in this project. And we are not only twinning to help Tallinn to develop, but we also, so to say, twinning these 2 intellectuals. They don't look like twins, but probably we find some similarities in their work that remains to be seen. Well, we have particular goals and objectives in this consortium. Of course, improving research methodologies is at the heart of the whole thing. We try to mobilize and amplify digital cultural heritage research locally, nationally and internationally. The idea is also to create a joint research hub for digital cultural heritage studies, DIGHT Hub, that will be based at the School of Humanities in Tallinn. We are creating a digital archive, which is today's theme, and here especially Juri Lotman's collection, but we also try to figure out how this could help actually digitizing collections of scholars in general. So that's one of the ideas. And there's also a kind of conceptual thought behind all these, that we would like also to try to build a semiotic theory of digital cultural heritage based on Lotman's and Eko's work in particular. And as a third point, we would like to promote interdisciplinary collaboration between researchers from different fields. And already this online workshop is part of this effort to try to bring us together. As said, the digitization of Lotman's archive is at the heart of the project. Merit will talk about that later today. There's an interest in giving broader access to those materials that have remained more like hidden so far, but with these methods we could give a broad access. We also think that this is a way of providing a possibility for new kind of research on cultural heritage, and that's another aspect. And of course also this will give a possibility to have a new insight into Lotman's work. As said, the launching of a DIGHT hub is one of the aims of the consortium, and this will happen already this year. In the end of this year, there will be the launching of DIGHT hub. It's not actually what I have here in the image, but it would be something more substantial. And hopefully it will be a meeting point for scholars, both nationally and internationally. And one of the aims is to create a prototype of twinned digital archive of Lotman and Eko. And the project is actually gathering already next week in Tallinn to brainstorm on how this prototype could look like and which kinds of features would that entail. So it will be fascinating to brainstorm on that. I took also this figure that shows the structure of the consortium. We have 6 work packages. First, the co-establishment of Digital Cultural Heritage Research Hub, and then a certain research part, a kind of creating the prototype of the Twin Archive, as said. And as the third point, the support for early stage researchers and excellence in teaching. These workshops are part of that work package, but we will also organize special events for early stage researchers, for example, a summer school later this year. Fourth package concentrates on strengthening research management capacity. So the idea is not only to realize this one project, but give us also possibilities of paving way for new projects in the future. And then 2 other last packages, one on communication, dissemination, exploitation, and then on project management. But this is the overall structure of the whole project. We have several upcoming events, and I would encourage you to have a look on our website, which is you can Google it with DIGHT-Net, and you can find also this list of events. We are now in this first one, online workshop 1, under the main title New Trends in Digital Culture Studies, and we will have several other workshops in this series. The second one will be the 25th of April on digital and ecological sustainability of cultural heritage. And it's already possible to register for that workshop. And the third one will be next September on digital representations of information. The Turku team, where I come from and Mila comes from, we also organize a series of twin lectures, especially to concentrate on the issue of gender in academia and in research world. And here the first twin lecture will be on the 28th of March under the title Gender, Intersectionality and Cultural Heritage Data. And also this workshop is already open for you to register. So I hope we can see all of you in these future workshops as well. Well, I suppose I stop sharing at this point and once more very warmly welcome you all to participate this online workshop today. And now I move the speech to Mila. It's your turn.
Thank you, Hannu. Yeah, so now it is my great pleasure to present you Gerben Zaagsma, who is an assistant professor in contemporary and digital history at the Center for Contemporary and Digital History, C2DH, at the University of Luxembourg. He's a specialist in Jewish and Yiddish history and digital history. He has written some outstanding publications about the politics of digitization of cultural heritage, and also pointed out the global perspective, revealing the unequal distribution of abundance of digitized materials. And quoting from his website, he's interested in exploring how technology shapes, frames, and constraints. I love the way you have written this, Gerben, so I wanted to phrase this. So how technology shapes, frames, and constraints historical research and our understanding of history. So the floor is yours now, Gerben.
Thank you very much, Mila, for the introduction, and thank you all very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm also very happy to see that so many of you are joining online. Let me share my slides, and then we can get started. I hope you can see my slides now. Fantastic. So yeah, as I said, many thanks, and it's really a great pleasure to be part of this first workshop, creation of a digital archive. I am going to talk to you today about digital archives and indeed what I call the politics of digitization. And I should perhaps say as a start that this is a theme that I very much approach as a historian who has worked extensively both with traditional archives, also a lot with microfilm, and now, of course, also digital and born digital materials. So perhaps as a start to frame this, it's important to note that, of course, digitization should be viewed in the long-term context of how technology has always shaped historical knowledge production and research practices. We know that all basic steps in the historical research process, gathering of materials, the processing of those materials, their analysis and the dissemination of research results are constituted by practices that have changed dramatically in the past decades because of new technologies. And on the slide, and I'm not sure how visible this is for those of you who have a small laptop screen, I did not sort of adjust it with a view on that, but you can see on the slide these basic steps and then some of the technology inflected changing practices that actualize those steps. So when we look at how historians gather their materials, the change is of course obvious from going to the physical archive and transcribing sources or excerpting them or taking notes. Historians from the late 19th century onwards began to acquire photos, From the 1920s onwards, they began to use photostats, an early photocopying technique. Then they started consulting microfilm in the 30s and 40s. And today we use their digitized versions, or we work with born digital data. But the point here is that as a means of preservation and reproduction of heritage materials, digitization is only the latest in a long line of technologies. In other words, digitization should be viewed in that long-term context of how technology has always shaped, framed, and expanded, or perhaps constrained historical knowledge production. Importantly, historians and humanists have also reflected for a long time on the impact of those new technologies, first mechanical aids, later computing, on their different disciplines. And you see an example here on the slide of a book from 1906 by the German Byzantine scholar Karl Krumbacher, who discussed in that booklet the utility of archival photography for education and for historical research. And similarly, questions about the political aspects of earlier reproduction technologies were also not absent from debate. You see on the slide the cover of the proceedings of the Round Table of Archives held in Kuala Lumpur in 1982, where the topic was the politics of microfilm. So we have a long tradition actually of reflecting on how these new technologies in heritage reproduction and preservation are sort of affecting also historical and humanities research. So that was the first point, digitization and the issues that it raises need to be historicized. Second point, the problems of abundance that are often associated with digitization and the creation of historical data sets need to be historicized too. Of course, digital historians often quote the late digital history pioneer Roy Rosenzweig. I think many of you might have heard of him, who famously observed in 2003 in a well-known article a shift from scarcity to a culture of digital abundance. That was, of course, in the era of the internet, the moment when broadband internet started coming up, but also this discourse about abundance goes back much further, as the example on the slide also shows the cover of the proceedings of a Yale conference on computers for the humanities in 1965, where one of the speakers actually talked of the problem of abundance in historical research. And this was at the time when social science data archives began to be created and were also quite heavily used by historians. Nevertheless, even if today abundance seems a reality in many parts of the global north, it's not often questioned and qualified in terms of what it does to historical research. And similarly, the question that Roy Rosenzweig also asked, will abundance bring better or more thoughtful history, often remains unanswered. And the implicit assumption, of course, is that this abundance brings better or more thoughtful history. But I think as historians, we could do a better job articulating that case by more openly reflecting upon this question. And meanwhile, digitization, of course, affects historical research. As Ian Milligan recently pointed out in his very nice Cambridge Elements book, The Transformation of Historical Research in the Digital Age, one of the costs of digitization is a gravitation towards digitized sources and topics at the expense of the still great undigitized, as he called it. And today I would like to focus on that great undigitized by focusing on the politics of digitization and historical knowledge production. I'll briefly talk about the politics of cultural heritage in general. I will also say something about the global state of digitization and then try to outline a model which we could use to analyze that process of digitization and its political dimensions. Importantly, I want to preface this by saying that, of course, these kinds of questions about how is our evidentiary base constituted, they are, of course, not new. They're not restricted to the digital realm. They are familiar from our analog past, so to speak. So this is really about, let's say, extending the critical questions that historians have always asked about their sources and about their methods to the digital realm. It's not about critiquing digital history. It's simply making sure that we transpose those questions also to the way we work today. And all of that can also be seen as part of a sort of broader critical turn that we can observe in the past decade in digital humanities and digital history. We've sort of moved from, let's say, more technological determinism to more reflection on methodologies and epistemological dimensions of the digital in how we do history and humanities research. We talk about tool criticism, data criticism, algorithmic criticism, code interface criticism, very important for historians, of course, digital source criticism. So there's a lot going on, a lot of reflection there in history and digital history. That critical turn has been conceptualized in different ways. Some have called it digital historiography. We call it in Luxembourg often digital hermeneutics. Some of you might be familiar with the very, very nice and important article of Helle Strandgaard Jensen, Digital Archival Literacy for All Historians. So these are different ways of, let's say, shining a more critical light on how the digital affects our work. And at the same time, we know relatively little about how the digital actually affects our work and how it affects historical research practices. That's a little bit surprising. There are some studies there, but there's not too much empirical work on really trying to figure out how historical research is affected by the digital. There was a recent small empirical case study by John Coburn, very, very interesting, who actually suggested that historians are actually quite aware of what he called digital selectivity, let's say the limitations of digital resources. But what was also very interesting in that small study that he did, there were some very telling generational differences going on there. Younger generations of historians who tended to gravitate more towards digital resources, but also were used more to surgical discovery, to the single search box, and perhaps did not see the value of browsing materials in what we could call the old-fashioned way, where you go to the archive and spend a lot of time going through folders, or you use microfilm and spend a lot of time going through microfilms. And the result of that might, of course, be a loss of an awareness of context and a risk of decontextualized history. And maybe some of you are also teaching digital history, might already have encountered that also with students. So that raises a lot of questions how we can sort of work towards a better digital literacy for historians and for future generations of historians. And of course, the question is not only what digitization means for historical research and knowledge production, but we should also turn our gaze outward and ask, okay, what does this mean from a public history point of view? What kind of history is consumed online? How is it consumed online? How is it co-created online? How is it perhaps censored online? Digital archives are, of course, only a small part of this, but an important part nonetheless. So let's return now to the topic at hand, the politics of digitization. First point, the politics of digitization should be framed within the broader context of the politics of heritage and its preservation. And we know that what counts as heritage has always been very political and contested. What societies choose to designate as heritage and what they thus deem worthy of preservation is very, very political. In the last 2 decades, there is a whole field of critical heritage studies that has arisen with many, many scholars and colleagues dealing with those questions. We know, of course, that archives are repositories of carefully selected and curated collections. They are not neutral. They enable certain reconstructions of the past. So they are powerful actors and potential gatekeepers in the production of historical knowledge. At the same time, traditional archives contain many silences. Well described in the book by Trouillot, Silence of the Archive in 1995, which led to a lot of debate about which histories the archive actually enables us to tell and which histories the archive might not enable us to tell. Now, since digitization is also not neutral, but is actually a selection of that analog selection, if you will, the question then becomes how do these older questions about heritage, power, the production and the construction of historical knowledge play out in the age of digitization? What are the histories? What kind of histories can we tell? What can we not tell with digital resources? And who can actually tell those stories? And how can we avoid that digitization simply reproduces the silences of the analog archive and instead opens up a space for new stories, for new perspectives. And digitization, I should say, is only one way to address the silences in the existing cultural record by creating new sources. But there are also various digital methodologies that exist that could be employed to also give voice to, let's say, heard or unheard voices, or to confront data absences in the traditional archive once it's digitized. There's a very nice article by Alexandra Ortolja-Beert and Julian Nayen, who have listed some of these possible approaches to do something about historical data absences. So that was the first point. We need to look at digitization in this broader context of the politics of heritage and its preservation. Second point, we should talk about digitization in the nation. It might sometimes appear as if the importance of the nation has diminished in the digital age, because digitization seems to sort of escape national boundaries. It transcends the nation, at least in terms of also of the research possibilities it offers. And of course, digital resources can be linked to the construction of identities and memory on many levels, from the local to the supra and transnational. But often the nation still looms large in the background, I would argue. It matters in shaping the context in which digitization takes place. Think, for instance, about funding. But it also matters as a cognitive framework of reference. The nation is often still the key focal point in the construction of memory and identity, in struggles for the past, in debates about what heritage should be valued and should be preserved. And that, of course, also applies to digital and digitized heritage. So yeah, the construction of the nation or its counter-narratives increasingly takes place online. And that's important to keep in mind. And of course, the more the past, the national past, is contested, the more its digitization can also become a site of contestation. And that can be exacerbated by the availability of resources. And the more limited resources you have, the higher the political stakes can be. And of course, that plays out in very, very different ways in different parts of the world. And I don't mean to say that everything is about the nation. That is, of course, a much too simple view. But as those of you who work perhaps in the field of transnational history know, there's always this question: how do the local, the national, and the transnational sort of intersect? And where are the boundaries? So it's always important to keep that sort of in mind also when we talk about digitization. So in light of these, let's say, broader parameters of cultural heritage digitization, what do we actually know about the state of digitization in a global perspective? Very briefly, it's unsurprisingly for all of you, very, very uneven. In a global perspective, inequalities in access abound. Global north-south divisions play a key role there, especially in terms of available resources. But at the same time, that binary also needs to be complicated a bit. It's important because it's a division that foregrounds economic development and the availability of resources for digitization. It also foregrounds the effects of colonialism, post-colonialism. However, it's a too, let's say, static idea of a global north-south binary also risks obscuring significant internal variation with regard to cultural heritage digitization within the global north and south, as is shown by the existence of, let's call it, digital north in the global south and digital south in the global north. And there's, of course, also a lot of debate, much more in general, going on about the utility of those terms. So without denying the importance and the impact of broader north-south inequalities, it's therefore important to also remain attentive to variations within what we now call the global north and south. And one example of that in Europe is, for example, the digitization of minority heritage, especially that of transnational communities and peoples. There is actually very little research into the global state of digitization. As far as I know, the latest attempt to at least chart this a little bit was this report, A New Age of Culture, done by the Economist Intelligence Unit. That's already 8 years old now. where they tried to solicit data from, I think, more than 240 institutions in 20 or 22 countries. And that actually confirms that that picture is quite right. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Europe and North America rank quite high when it comes to digitization, but so do China and Indonesia, or countries like Mexico, Peru, and Thailand when it comes to access to cultural heritage. So that really showed a fairly varied picture, but again, it's only a very partial picture, and it's very difficult to get a sort of complete overview. We have better data for Europe from the so-called numeric and enumerate surveys that were done between 2007 and 2017. Unfortunately, that is also when the latest report was published, and since then we haven't had one of those surveys, which I think is a great pity. Couple of things that were quite noticeable in that last report of digitization in Europe, heritage digitization in Europe in 2017, was that a lot of our cultural records, specifically when it comes to archives, remains offline. And crucially, a lot of it cannot even be found online for a lack of online cataloging. And that highlights, I think, an often overlooked point, namely that access to cultural heritage in the digital age is not just about digitization, but it starts with access to the descriptive metadata and cataloging. And all of that, of course, impacts our research. And it also means that we need to think about what is actually the balance between online and offline, and what happens if we move completely online and sort of start forgetting about what actually is not digitized or easily accessible and simply lies in the archive. So if we talk about that impact of digitization, the next question then would be how can we critically engage digital archives? And in order to perform a more structured analysis of the process of digitization and its political dimensions, I like to draw on a scheme that was proposed 25 years ago by the sociologist Richard Harvey Brown and the librarian Beth Davis Brown in what I think is quite a seminal article called The Making of Memory, the Politics of Archives, Libraries and Museums in the Construction of a National Consciousness. And in that analysis, what Brown and Brown did is try to explore four what they called ideological and political functions of archival and curatorial work, as understood by librarians and archivists in the United States, and sort of try to show how they entailed deployments of power as they described it. And I've put on the slide those dimensions. I called them the analog dimensions. On the left and then on the right, you see what I think are their digital equivalents. So first of all, Brown and Brown talk about the allocation of collections. Where are collections kept? Who controls them? In the digital context, the question there will be which institutions digitize and control digital collections. The next question was about collection development. What is collected, what is selected, what is stored, but perhaps also not cataloged, so made accessible somehow intellectually. In the digital realm, that will be the question, what is actually digitized and why, but also what is metadated and what is perhaps OCR'd or HDR'd. Brown and Brown talk about cataloging and classification. In the digital realm, that is of course also about classification and online inventories, as well as metadata schemata, and they talk about circulation and access. So who gets to see what is in the archive? And in the digital realm, that would be how is access actually provided, and how is it mediated? And I want to briefly talk in the remaining roughly 10 minutes about those 4 points. So the first question then is which institutions and actors digitize and control digital collections. Of course, many actors. As you will not be surprised to hear, we have national, regional and local archives and libraries and museums that engage in digitization. We have supranational projects such as the Project Gutenberg, Internet Archive, Europeana. We have commercial players such as Google, Google Books, Google Arts and Culture, but a very important player these days, of course, Ancestry.com, which also collaborates with a lot of archives in Europe to digitize. That's sometimes a bit of an uncomfortable trade-off for archives, but if Ancestry provides the funding, then what do you do if you want to have your material digitized and you can't solicit funding in another way? But we also have many foundations and NGOs that are involved. Most of you will probably have heard of the Endangered Archives project that digitizes endangered archives in many different parts of the world. There are, of course, also many small-scale academic projects by individuals or smaller teams. I think the Lotman archive could be considered as one of those projects. And there's plenty of non-academic projects by collectors, hobbyists, etc. Very, very often underestimated how much material about certain topics have been put online by those communities. And there is, of course, speaking about communities, the very, very important phenomenon of community archives. So it sort of ranges from a lot of top-down, if you will, to much more bottom-up initiatives in digitization. One thing to add to that, I don't have time to go into much detail, but of course this issue of who digitizes and who controls digital collections also raises a range of moral and legal concerns in the context of global North-South collaborations in digitization. Very nicely summarized by Johannes Brits and Peter Lohr from South Africa 20 years ago in an article, A Moral Reflection on the Digitization of Africa's Documentary Heritage, where they asked how the digitization of African heritage would benefit Africans, and then listed a number of things to pay attention to. As I said, I don't have time to delve further into that, but it's really, really important also if we consider global digitization in a more global perspective. So I sort of wanted to draw attention to that as well, even if we cannot talk much about it now. The second thing, what is digitized and why and what is being metadated? Of course, digitization is about selection. It's far from neutral. There are many criteria that we might have for digitization. There are, of course, preservation concerns of fragile materials, easy access to collection highlights and often used materials. There's also the research value of certain collections or academic research agendas. And there is the question of memory politics, what kind of public discourses on the past you have in certain societies, what kind of national concerns play a role in digitization. Think of national archives, national digital archives or libraries showcasing national heritage, or in the Europeana case, some sort of attempt to create a sense of a European heritage in the digital realm. And all these criteria are reflected in funding patterns, but one thing that is often quite noticeable is those selection criteria are not often made explicit. So very often we don't really know why we see what we see online. And in addition to that, the issue of selection is of course also a question again, what is actually cataloged and metadated, so is also made more intellectually accessible. And of course that is changing a lot now that especially OCR and AI influenced HDR techniques such as transcribers are really offering lots of new possibilities to open up digitized materials also for search and things like that. Third point that Brown and Brown made was about classification. Now, of course, we know that classification is also far from neutral. As Brown and Brown nicely put it, classifications never emerge solely from the material to be classified, since our ways of defining the material itself are shaped by the dominant intellectual or political paradigms through which we view it. And of course, in the digital archive, the ways in which structure is provided, thematic collections are chosen, are titled, are arranged, the way in which keywords and other types of metadata are chosen and are added, and how extensively they are applied, they all reflect social, cultural, and political dispositions and human biases. And that is something to always keep in mind also when we work with the digital archive. lot of discussion about that, particularly in the context of working with the colonial archive, where you often see that metadata or inventories might reflect the perspective of the colonizer, the former colonizer and colonial administrations, but far from the perspectives of those who were colonized. And that is, of course, a major issue if those materials are being put online and those metadata and descriptions sort of determine how you access or find materials. Here too, we need to say that recent advances in AI provide a lot of potential for curating digital archival data in a different way and sort of address some of these biases that are introduced by those human subjectivities. And that brings me to the fourth point, the question of how access is provided and mediated. Of course, digitization itself does not guarantee access. There's still the question who can access which digital resources and where. On the micro level, that is about, let's say, open access versus perhaps paywalled access or institutional access, where you can only consult a digital archive in a library or an archive. On the macro level, on the global level, we know, of course, also that inequalities in access to online repositories and historical sources are profound. In part, that is due to technological issues, such as internet access and speeds and bandwidth, the question whether people use more mobile internet versus broadband and how that all affects this topic of access. But the result can also be a major ethical issue, namely that a lot of the digitized heritage of the South can sometimes only be accessed by those in the North. And that is an issue. We have minimal computing as one technological solution that has been proposed by some colleagues in digital humanities to address such inequalities. But that is something to very much keep in mind. Also, in terms of access, things are very, very unequal and a lot of inequities exist. But access is also, there's also the question of how that access is actually mediated. So how does interface design, how do the implementation of metadata schemes, of search and retrieval options mediate access to the contents of digital resources? How is knowledge represented through interfaces, so to speak? Which perspectives are offered? In the case of indigenous heritage, are originating communities also involved there, and what kind of solutions can be found to address that? With regard to that mediation, responsible data use then, of course, becomes important, and we can now draw upon sets of international guidelines, such as the well-known FAIR principles that talk about findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reuse of digital materials. And we now also have the CARE principles for indigenous data governance that describe how data could be treated in such a way to ensure that indigenous governance over the data, governance of originating communities can also be respected. So there is a lot moving, so to speak, in that field as well. I'm going to skip this slide and move straight then. So here you have again the 4 points that I just discussed. And I wanted to finish by making some remarks and offering some considerations for digital archives, perhaps also with a view of opening up the discussion that we will have later in the afternoon. First of all, I think it's important when we are creating digital resources to engage a really broad range of stakeholders in the development of these resources. That means heritage professionals, obviously archivists, librarians, information specialists, but also historians and humanists, and also depending on the audiences that we are trying to target, the publics that should be involved. That is also a way of addressing biases, for example, through the co-design of interfaces, through the co-development of classifications and metadata, crowdsourcing initiatives to accomplish that, gaining input for selection for digitization. So that's all very important. What is also very important is to think much more about how we can promote transparency in digital archives. So include more information about the funding of projects, about the selection criteria that were used, the metadata that were applied, what thinking went into the way in which access modalities are constructed, the interface and search options are provided. And also, quite importantly, think about providing links to relevant, let's say, related offline sources. So digital archives in that sense also provide a comprehensive picture of, let's say, the totality of heritage that might be available if we're dealing with certain topics. So sort of finding ways to promote transparency, and some archives and libraries are actually experimenting with different ways to do that, is also very important. Needless to say, education is key. We still have some way to go to really promote digital literacy. If you look at skills manuals and lesson books for history students, then some of those books engage the digital more than others. But the first book that really comprehensively engages also the digital in all its aspects probably still needs to be written. So there's a lot of work to do to really integrate digital literacy in the history curriculum. And perhaps finally, I think it's also too important to rethink and reevaluate the purposes and the uses of digitization, and reflect more on the value of the non-digital in digital humanities and digital history practices, and especially keep in mind that those, in the end, the offline and the online are complementary. It's not an either-or proposition, which is sometimes suggested. No, we really need to think about how both sort of complement each other in our work. But we should also recognize that since most archives will not be digitized in the future, the non-digital, the offline, will remain very important, and that is something to attend to as well. So that brings me to the end. Thank you very much for your attention. I look very much forward to the discussion. For those of you who are more interested in this topic, I put on the slide the article about digital history and the politics of digitization, where I discuss a bit more some of the issues that I've now touched upon as well. And also a recently published article on the history of digital history, about which I talked a little bit in the beginning. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think this was very interesting and thought-provoking presentation, and I would have a lot of questions to ask and discuss with you. But now I think it's my role as a kind of like host of this. I should give the floor for others as well to ask questions and you know, if they have some points that they want to make here. So for all the attendants of this workshop, please either raise your hand. There is this small hand device or tool here on Zoom, or you can also type your question to the Slack and to chat, and then we can address that. So now the floor is.
I see one comment in the chat already. John Goodyear noting that university archives are also an important institution. Yes, completely right. Thank you also, John. Yeah, absolutely. It's of course a very, very important actor in terms of smaller scale digitization as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I think your presentation was extremely rich, and it was kind of like you really exemplified very well how actually as we historians, we kind of like talk about this sudden abundance, but how actually there are different nuances, and how actually this abundance is very complex and kind of like it really depends on these different perspectives that we take here. And I also think that kind of like the way you also at the end emphasized kind of like or had these considerations for archives digitizing. So I think that was really, really helpful. I was also thinking, as you are an expert on this field, and I was just thinking that if you would have a magic wand and you could change anything, any one thing in the field of digitizing cultural heritage materials, which would you like to change or improve? And what would, why would you like to do that?
I think it would be, for me, it would be most important to really think more about, creating, as it were, a sort of set of transparency guidelines. So to really think more, how can all institutions or actors that digitize provide more information about why they digitized, how they did it, what were the considerations that went into creating the metadata. Also try to create a sort of history of those metadata, which sometimes is happening now, of course. But I think that would be most important, because as a historian who uses digital collections, what I'm often struck by is how little information you actually find about how those collections, how online collections are constituted or why. Again, there are different ways in which this is being done. There are experiments with interfaces where you can sort of show what is in the archive. There have even been experiments where digital resources have been created together with historians to actually jointly create an interface and sort of provide more insight into what the resource offers and does not offer. And I think those initiatives are very important. But I think we still probably need a lot more collaboration. That means historians need to, I think, talk much more to archivists who are really the experts in this field and who are partners in the co-construction of knowledge and not just service providers. And that is sometimes, let's say, and perhaps an attitude that you still encounter. And that's, of course, a bit problematic. So I think what is also really important is think more about how we kind of combine those different perspectives in the creation of those resources, because those perspectives can be quite different and they are not always overlapping. Archives might have different interests in digitization than, for example, academics have. Archives might be more interested, of course, in preserving fragile materials as their first, and that's also, you need to justify where you spend the money, so to speak. Whereas academics might be more interested in having particular other sub-collections digitized, and so there is a lot of diverging interests sometimes as well as overlapping interests. I see actually someone in the chat talking about not having enough manpower and resources. I completely agree. Yeah.
Yes. We have 2 more questions. The first question is Susruth Padri. Please go ahead.
Hey, my name is Susruth Badri. I work with the Center for Digital Humanities in Uppsala, at Uppsala University in Sweden.
Yeah.
So we are in the process of digitizing historical Swedish medical periodicals, and we have done layout analysis now. We are collecting metadata, doing some OCR. We have done some OCR, and we are improving it right now. So recently, one of my colleagues from the humanities has asked me about the biases that we have, that we are taking into consideration during this process. And that was very important when we are doing something like this. So I saw you mentioned something about bias. I would ask you if you could elaborate more about the biases that engineers like me, who are in the help digitizing these things, that I have to keep in mind as we are going towards like
Yeah. A very nice question. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I think so. The kind of bias that I'm, for instance, thinking about is what happens if you digitize an archive and you use as a basis for the inventory and the metadata the existing, let's say, analog information about that archive. And there are very nice examples of. Let me give the example of a colonial archive. There's a Dutch archival scholar, Charles Jurgens, who once gave a very, very nice example of an archive about Indonesian independence fighters, with an analog archive, which is in the National Archive in The Hague in the Netherlands. But the way that archive is described is with the terminology of the Dutch colonial administration. So that is the view that is sort of imposed on the material and through which you enter that material. And of course, in the view of the Dutch colonial administration, those were not independent fighters. They were terrorists, they were whatever. But this was a very, very different view. Obviously a problematic view. And if that is then the inventory, or let's say also the metadata that will be used when you digitize it, you have a major problem. And that doesn't mean, I mean, think this is too something where you need to be transparent. So in an ideal situation, then you think, of course, about other ways to describe it, but you also make that process transparent, and you might even include information about, well, this was actually the old way in which it was described, which again, there are experiments with that are being done. But that is the kind of bias that I have in mind. So where those older descriptions that very much reflect the time that those original archives were created are sort of being used to feed into the digital archive creation. So where you're effectively reproducing certain ways of looking at the material. And that too is something where you sometimes need to consult a broad range of actors to get inputs on what is the best way to disclose that material. But then what, of course, is very important and interesting is that AI now seems to sometimes provide possibilities to sort of do large-scale analysis of data in digital archives and look at different ways of perhaps classifying the material, where you sort of take out that human factor. Of course, in terms of how the models are trained, you still are dealing with a human factor. So, and you might know that much better than I do. I'm a historian and I'm not a computer scientist. But you need to reflect on how that human factor sort of feeds into this. And a very, very nice, very small example, but I once encountered an example of a single scholar who was working on a particular collection and sort of developed of images and developed basically a metadata scheme that was completely based on his own view on the material. And that was it. And that's, of course, one way to do it, but you can really ask, like, okay, what happens if an individual simply decides, like, this is the view, these are the keywords that I'm going to use to describe the images in my collection, without reflecting on the fact that that is only one way of looking at that material that is being imposed on the material, as it were, in terms of access.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again. Yeah, that was a very good, very nice question. Yeah.
Next question goes to Hannu Salmi.
Well, thank you so much. That was a rich presentation with many ideas. I liked your points for consideration in the end, and there were many themes that could be discussed further. But I particularly like the idea of how to maintain the value of the non-digital, and also the idea how to create a digital archive that would also highlight the value of the non-digital. And if you have any good examples to benchmark, I would be happy to receive.
Thank you. That's a very, very nice question as well. There's one example that comes to mind. That's again an example from the Netherlands. So the Dutch National Archive in The Hague has put together a page on the topic of slavery. And of course, the Netherlands were heavily involved in the slave trade. And on that page, they basically have a list of digitized materials that pertain to the Dutch role in the global slave trade. But they also list a number of archives that are not digitized, but that nevertheless provide materials relevant to that topic. And I think that is one example where you bring together at least, let's say, the knowledge about what exists in terms of archival material for people who might be interested in that topic. And it relates a little bit, of course, to the debate about hidden heritage, hidden archives. I find that always a bit of a problematic terminology, because it's not really hidden. It's just hidden in terms of not being accessible online. And of course, that then you have a lot of questions about, okay, who has the privilege to actually go to the real archive and who hasn't, and things like that. But it's not hidden in the sense that it's not out there. It's just not easily accessible online. So I find that terminology always a little bit misleading. And of course, there is a bigger question about what does happen, and we see that already when people, how is historical research steered in new directions, and also perhaps in terms of research questions being asked by the existence of digital archives. And if people start to gravitate more and more to what is available online because it's easier accessible, and we see that sometimes already. In Luxembourg, we have many students who then think like, oh, we have a wonderful digital newspaper archive, so they would like to work with that, and this is great. This is, it's for them, it's a very good experience to work with. But you really notice already that you need to start explaining what happens when you, for example, search in that archive without realizing that you're only looking at a selection. There might be many more newspapers out there that are not in the digital newspaper archive that could also be interesting to look at. And it's not, so there's always the issue with the question of representativeness of the digital archive. And that is of course something that historians have always faced. But it's a little bit easier to lose that out of sight if you're confronted with millions of pages that have been digitized. It's easier to not be aware of the fact that you're still dealing with a selection, perhaps. And that is still something to keep in mind. So it's not so much in that sense something new for historians, but it is something that needs to be relearned in a certain way. I would put it like that. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
And the final question goes to John Goodyear.
Mila, thanks very much. John Goodyear over at the University of Birmingham in the UK.
Yeah.
I come from the perspective that, first of all, brilliant presentation. I should put that on the record. Absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed listening to what you had to say.
Thank you. Thank you.
I come from the perspective of actually teaching the archive. So I'm leading a postgraduate module entitled Digital Transformation. And I put in the chat box earlier on about an archive that is at the home of the University of Birmingham, namely the Cadbury Research Library, with 4 million documents and 250,000 books, the vast majority of which are not digitized, they are analog. And one of the issues that archive has is the absence of a digital policy. So there's a code of practice at university level which governs how the archive works, but when it comes to the actual digital side of things, there isn't a policy in place. And my question to you is, could you give the audience, could you give us some idea of your thinking with regards to the formulation of that policy, the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities and the challenges of the creation of such a policy in a place where it doesn't actually have a policy that governs it?
That's a very nice question. Thank you very much. I'm not entirely sure if I'm the right person to ask, or if that is something to ask more experienced archivists who actually have been involved in digitization projects. What I only can say is that there are very, very different policies out there. Indeed, from what you say, no policy. And trying to invent the wheel to obviously national archives who might have decades of experience already with different forms of digitization. I think the point there to make would simply be for smaller institutions to consult with bigger ones who have that experience and see what they might learn from that, and sort of how they might adapt or tailor those experiences and, let's say, best practices to their own scenario, to their own situation. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Gerben. Well done.
Thank you, Jones. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Gerben, and thank you for all discussions here. Now I think it's time for us to have a 5-minute break so that we can all stretch a bit our legs, and let's convene back here 15 past. Okay, hello. I think we could now continue. Everybody has probably stretched a little bit of their legs, and we are fresh to go again. And now it is my great pleasure to present you the next speaker, who is Dr. Maran, who is the director of the Juri Lotman Semiotics repository at Tallinn University. Her disciplinary background is in semiotics, and she has studied meaning-generating processes in human culture across a very broad range of different media, such as literature, digital literature, cinema, and computer games, as well as semiotic approaches to understanding complexity in cultural systems. Also, education and digitality are overarching themes in her research. And as the head of the Juri Lotman Semiotics repository, she's responsible for digitizing this collection in our project, as Hannu already mentioned. So, Merit, I'm eagerly looking forward to your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mila, and thank you for this kind introduction, and also for inviting me to speak here today. I will share my screen. So, can you see?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So my talk will be based on our experience in preparing Juri Lotman's archive for digitization. So I will speak primarily from a practitioner's perspective. However, I will also try to connect our experience with some more universal tendencies that characterize the transformation from physical archive to a digital one, and thus hope to reflect on some more generalized, well, not maybe guidelines, but let's say aspects to take into account when building a digital scholarly archive. And when I began working in Juri Lotman's semiotics repository at Tallinn University in 2021, parts of the collection that we had here had already been organized to some extent. However, the archive had not yet been catalogued, and for the most part, it remained in what could be described as a state of creative chaos. And from the very beginning, as we started thinking about archival structure and metadata schemes for our physical archive, how we want to build it up, we knew that one of our key goals for the near future would be the digitization of this material. And this meant that from the very start, we were working with two concepts in parallel. So on the one hand, organizing the material within this physical space according to the logic of traditional archives, more or less. And on the other hand, already anticipating the possibilities of the digital space as well. So to ensure that the archive that we are creating would function effectively both in analog form and as a digital collection. And in my talk today, I aim to share our experiences in managing this transition, in navigating this shift from one archival logic to another, and exploring the opportunities and challenges that come with it. And I have to kind of stress that at present moment, we are still in this initial phase of creating the digital archive, which involves structuring the material, creating metadata, and preparing documents for digitization. Therefore, I will focus at the moment on aspects which are most relevant to this particular stage. And I will set aside for now discussions on interface design or some specific technical solutions. And before diving into main topic, I'd like to provide also some background for my talk, because given the size of our audience today, I assume that some of you might not be too familiar with our project and our archive, and offering a bit of context will, I hope, help in following this presentation. So, as Hannu also already said, the archive we are discussing today belonged to Juri Lotman, but also his wife, Sara Mints. Both of them were distinguished scholars who worked in the University of Tartu. And they were born in St. Petersburg, but moved to Estonia in the 1950s. And then here they played a very significant role in shaping the intellectual and academic landscape. So, as was already said, Juri Lotman is known as a semiotician, as a literary scholar and cultural theorist, and also as the co-founder of Tartu Moscow School of Semiotics. And Sara Mints was an esteemed literary scholar and professor of Russian literature, and very widely known for her research on the Silver Age in Russian literature. So, and together they led a very active and highly influential academic life in Tartu, publishing extensively, organizing scholarly events, teaching numerous courses, and also maintaining a vast network of correspondence. And also their apartment in Tartu became, in a way, a very important meeting point for local intellectual life. So in this way, their archive captures not only their intellectual legacy, but also the broader dynamics of academic and cultural life of their time. Now, a couple of words about the archive itself. Sara Mints passed away in 1990, and Juri Lotman followed in 1993. And after Lotman's death, the archive was actually initially intended to go to the University of Tartu. Lotman's successors had made agreements already with the university, and in 1995, they donated a significant part of his epistolary archive, along with all the materials from his university office, to the university library in Tartu. However, these negotiations regarding compensation for the archive and some other issues quite soon reached a deadlock. And as a result, the family decided not to transfer the remaining materials to Tartu, and instead began searching for a new home for the archive. And ultimately, this is how it arrived to Tallinn University. But this transfer to Tallinn was incomplete, as the portion already that was given to Tartu before remained there. So as a result, for decades, the archive has remained divided between these two cities, making research quite complicated in many ways. And now finally, with this twinning project that was introduced at the beginning of our seminar, we have now reached this point where we can reunite Lotman's and Saara Mints's archive, at least in the digital form. Now, I would like to say a few words about the content and scope of the archives as well. On the Tartu side, the archival materials are part of the broader collection of personal archives held by the University of Tartu Library. And the materials are divided into 3 separate fonts. The first is Personal Archive of Juri Lotman, which includes biographical information, documents related to his work at the university, his scientific writings, and etc. The second is the Personal Archive of Saara Mints, containing similar categories as Lotman's archive. And the third is their joint epistolary archive. And the Tartu archive was organized already by the year 2000, if I'm not mistaken, and we are currently in the process of digitizing this side of the archive. In Tallinn, the archive is a part of the Semiotics repository. It is a small memory unit established specifically to manage the archive and library of Juri Lotman and Saara Mints, and also to foster research into their legacy and organize the publication of their archival materials. And in Tallinn, we have organized the archive into 8 separate fonts: the epistolary archive of Juri Lotman and Saara Mints, biographical materials of Juri Lotman and Saara Mints, scientific activity of Lotman, scientific activity of Mints, photographs, materials related to other individuals, materials gifted by others, and lastly, the library of Juri Lotman and Saara Mints, which includes around 15,000 books. So as you can see, the systematization of the fonts in Tallinn differs somewhat from what they have in Tartu. And one of the reasons for that is that in Tartu, the archival materials of Lotman and Mints form just one small part of a larger collection of personal archives, whereas our Semiotics repository is exclusively dedicated to the archives of Lotman and Mints. And as a result, we have made finer distinctions at the level of fonts, while still trying to follow the Tartu archival logic where possible, in order for us to kind of facilitate this future digital unification in a better way. And as we will discuss further on, there are several other differences between these 2 archives that make unifying these materials into a single coherent digital archive quite challenging. However, when it comes to creating scholarly digital archives, this is likely quite a common issue. Materials are often scattered across multiple institutions, sometimes even across countries, and are organized and described according to very different principles. Hence, we can see it as a universal challenge for such digital scholarly archive projects. So in what follows, I will address some of the significant changes that occur in archives in the process of creating a digital archive, and reflect on these aspects in the context of our own experience of preparing the Lotman and Mints archive for digitization. And this list, of course, is not exhaustive. Due to time constraints, I have chosen those aspects that have been either most thought-provoking for us in this process or relevant to the material we worked with. But there are definitely many more aspects to consider, maybe which we can also discuss in later on together. But at the moment, I will touch upon 5 aspects: the structural organization of the archive, contextual integrity, metadata creation, materiality, and accessibility and sensitive information. So firstly, probably one of the most relevant shifts that occurs between physical and digital archive is how it affects the structural organization. In physical archives, they are typically arranged according to single descriptive system that reflects provenance, where the materials come from, and original order. And this often follows a font-based approach where the materials are grouped by creator and then divided into series, sub-series, and individual items, forming this fixed and kind of hierarchical structure. And finding materials relies on their placement within the structure using binding aids, catalogs, and classification systems. Since digital archives use metadata-based search, the structure is more dynamic and can be reshaped based on different user needs. So instead of being arranged in a single physical order, materials can be grouped and assessed in multiple ways using different metadata fields, date, keywords, format, subject, etc. And in that way, this metadata allows multiple views of the same material and enables a more flexible and personalized exploration of the archive. So for example, in Tartu, where the archive was originally described before the idea of creating a digital archive was even considered, metadata is applied at the file level. If we look at the epistolary archive there, the font is organized into thematic series. So, for example, letters from family members, individual correspondence, institutions, etc. And within this series, materials are divided into archival files. So each file typically contains all the letters from one particular correspondence. For instance, letters from Boris Uspensky are grouped into a separate file. And in Tartu, the description of archival material is made at the file level and not on the level of individual item, which in this case would be a separate letter, right? So in a physical archive, providing metadata at the file level is completely sufficient because files typically group related materials together, providing context for their description. So item level metadata might seem even redundant because individual items within a file often share the broad characteristics, and applying it could introduce unnecessary complexity. So additionally, in physical archives, organizational structures such as file, folders, boxes, or shelves provide contextual guidance. And in this sense, again, the need for item level description is reduced. Now, if we compare it to digital archive, it's the item level description that makes the most sense, because by describing every letter in the archive, not only specifying the name of the correspondent, but also adding the exact date, location, content keywords, and names mentioned for each item separately, we can then open up new possibilities for analysis. For example, if we think about our archive, such approach enables us to arrange Lotman's and Mintz's correspondence on a map, explore their communication during particular periods in their lives, or categorize their letters into thematic patterns or schemes. So, and all of this cannot be done if the metadata exists only on the level of the file. Therefore, kind of tailoring metadata to the archive's medium helps to unlock some new analytical possibilities and also enhances flexibility and dynamic understanding of materials. So on the Tallinn side, while we have followed the traditional hierarchical organization of the physical archive, we have at the same time focused on providing this very precise metadata for each individual item as well. Now, closely connected to the previous point, but still a separate issue in a way, is the aspect of contextual integrity of the archive, which was also already mentioned, and that it is often argued that digital archives may lead to the loss of contextual integrity due to the fact that archival items in digital space are more easily and recontextualized, so to say. So, and as was said, in physical archive, items are preserved within a structured hierarchical context. And when digitized, this structure can sometimes become fragmented, and an item can exist outside of its original archival order, making it in some sense much harder to understand its relationship to other materials. But at the same time, while there exists this risk of decontextualization, digital technologies also offer significant advantages in revealing the interconnectedness of archival materials. For example, digital archives rebuild context through metadata, linking, and visualization tools, enabling again this multiple contextual views based on our or users' needs. So if we consider, for example, a scenario where we are interested in a specific manuscript of a research article by Lotman from, let's say, the 1950s in a physical archive, then because articles from the same period are physically grouped together, we can readily view this manuscript in the context of his other works from that period of life. In a digital archive, however, it's quite likely that our path to this particular manuscript will not follow the chronological order of his writings. For example, we can search it using keywords, and in that case, this temporal context can go unnoticed unless we specifically request that view. But at the same time, as was said, digital archive offer new opportunities. For instance, the manuscripts that we are searching for can be linked to related items, such as conference presentations on the same topic or letters associated with this particular research. Thus, it enables us for more dynamic connections and also instantaneous navigation between materials, which in physical archive would usually remain divided. So we can say that the digital archives do risk losing original archival context, but they can also compensate by offering new and more dynamic ways to connect and interpret materials. And for us, the challenge here lies again in ensuring this meaningful metadata and relational linking, so that decontextualization doesn't result in loss of meaning, but rather in new ways of seeing connections. And this is something that we have also aimed to do throughout our current work. Another relevant difference between physical and digital archives is the way metadata is created. And in the case of physical archives, as you all know, it's usually archivists or librarians that provide metadata. And in digital archives, there is more variety in how it is created. So in digital archives, it can be created by curators, but also by users or machines. And each of these types plays a significant role in digital archives, often complementing each other in a way that can actually enhance searchability, accessibility, and accuracy as well. So curator-created metadata usually follows professional standards and ensures accuracy, consistency, and authority, but it can also be restrictive ideologically or in other ways. User-created metadata comes from researchers or online communities offering diverse perspectives and flexibility, but sometimes lacking structure. And machine-generated metadata uses AI or automated systems to process large amounts of data efficiently, but the problem is that it may require human validation to correct errors. And while curator-created metadata, as we said, is traditionally considered the most accurate, then digital archives, particularly in scholarly collections like the Semiotics repository, offer new opportunities to enhance this descriptive metadata. And in our work, we have actually felt that building the digital archive and the opportunities that emerge with this will enable us to find answers to some of the unresolved issues with materials that we have not been able to identify, or probably also even correct some of the mistakes we might have made in the process of describing the archival documents. For example, in terms of user-generated metadata, there has actually been a degree of community involvement throughout the description process in our physical archive as well. We have contacted many colleagues, friends, and former students of Lotman and Mintz, as well as other researchers, with requests to help us identify some manuscripts or letters or photographs. And we have received a lot of invaluable feedback on our work. So, but while some external involvement is possible in physical archives as well, the digital archive could provide a platform to enable such community involvement on a much wider scale. And as we imagine it, researchers can contribute insights by leaving comments or questions on archival materials, and in that way transforming this archive into a space for scholarly dialogue. As for machine-generated metadata, one of the main benefits would be the ability, of course, to process large amounts of information, but also the ability to reveal connections and identify patterns that may not be immediately apparent to human curators. For example, in our experience, a large part of the materials in Tallinn side of the archive were completely scattered. There were thousands of separate sheets of manuscripts and fragments that we had to identify and link together. And quite often we were dealing with unpublished texts. So making connections between these fragments was incredibly time consuming and often involved also a bit of guesswork. And it is quite likely that AI-based tools could greatly streamline this process and help to address some unresolved issues exactly by seeing those patterns in large amounts of data that we just cannot humanly process in the same way. Another aspect worth mentioning is the problem of materiality. In digitizing archival materials, we, as was also already mentioned, inevitably lose aspects of their materiality and sensory experience. The physicality of documents, the texture of the paper, the depth of ink, the weight and binding is something that we cannot really replicate digitally. Also the smell and the feel of old materials, which is often can add some context to research, are lost, and so on. So while digital archives greatly enhance accessibility, they also present challenges in preserving this full sensory and contextual richness of historical documents. And in preparing our archive for digitization, we have also grappled with the issue of materiality in determining which physical aspects of archival documents should be considered to have informational value and which ones do not. For instance, when digitizing photographs, if we have identical copies, we typically select only the best preserved copy for digitization. However, if the copies are printed on different types of paper, it raises the question of whether they can be considered identical or not, or whether this slight difference in the medium can also be of interest to someone. And at the same time, even if we decide to digitize both versions, we won't necessarily manage to mediate the difference in materials well enough for it to serve its purpose. And a similar problem occurs, for example, with manuscripts that are produced on typewriters. While using a typewriter, one typing could produce 3 copies simultaneously. Maybe some of you remember, maybe not, but there was such a thing as carbon paper used, which is a thin paper coated with ink, which was used for making duplicates, copies of documents when typing. So naturally, the original is visually the sharpest, and the carbon copies appear a bit hazier. And in such cases, when we have the option, we of course always prefer to digitize only the original if they are identical. However, while this ensures high quality digital surrogates, it also limits researchers' ability to comprehend the material aspect of what it meant to write with a typewriter. And this part of the process, in a way, is eliminated in digital archive. So although we of course always add to the description the info about the carbon copies, it still removes this aspect of typewriting from our attention. And there are many other similar examples of this problem with materiality. So, and the last aspect I would bring out here, which can be seen as a significant shift in archival practices, is the accessibility and the handling of sensitive information. While physical archives restrict access to or due to the factors such as location, limited hours, preservation concerns, digital archives offer global instant access and thereby are considered to kind of democratizing research. However, this increased accessibility also makes managing sensitive materials a more pressing challenge. It has been interesting to note that in the physical archives of Lotman and Mints, both in Tallinn and in Tartu, the regulation of sensitive information so far has been quite informal. The primary safeguard has been the archivists themselves, who directly communicate with the researchers to understand their needs and also to ensure responsible access to some extent, at least. However, as we now transition to a digital format where these materials will be accessible online, a more structured and rigorous approach is quite essential. So while the overarching goal of this project is to make Juri Lotman's archive freely accessible to all interested audiences, we must also acknowledge and respect certain limitations that come with it. And first and foremost, much more attention need to be given to this, how do we identify sensitive content? And in some cases, such as documents containing medical information, the rules are quite straightforward. However, many situations are more complex and require a nuanced approach. For example, when we are dealing with some correspondence between family members of Lotman, then even if the letters do not contain personal aspects of people's lives who are still alive today, there still can be some quite personal moments. So there needs to be much more careful consideration of such materials. and to what extent do we want to share them. For example, while some materials may remain restricted from the general public, they could still be accessible to researchers under specific conditions. However, there is this question, to what extent can we regulate such cases with universal guidelines, or should it be evaluated separately in each case? And in order to find answer to these issues, we plan to involve the ethics committee in the design process of the Twinned Digital Archive prototype in order exactly to ensure this correct management of sensitive data. So to sum up, our work on digitizing Juri, Lotman and Saara Mintsa archive has in many ways been this kind of continuous balancing act between finding our way between traditional archival practices and new possibilities of the digital world. And as this experience has kind of shown to us over and again, is that the digital archive cannot be a direct replica of its physical counterpart. Instead, it reshapes how we engage with historical materials, offering new ways to search, connect, and interpret information. But in order to fully leverage the opportunities that the digital environment offers, we need to structure and describe the archive in a way that integrates these opportunities at the very core. So looking ahead, our hope is that the digital archive we're building won't be a static resource, but instead a dynamic system that will continue to grow and evolve, and that will be shaped by contributions of various scholars and various archivists and technology as well. So with this, I say thank you for your attention, and I look forward for our discussion and questions.
Thank you so much, Merit. What an excellent presentation again. And although I'm part of this project, I learned a lot with your presentation. So thank you so much. Now we have again time for questions and comments. And again, I would like to ask you to either raise your hand or you can also post your question to the chat. And now I can see that there is Janet Habash. He has a question. Please, Janet.
Yeah. Good morning. Thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering about the idea of the structure and the guidelines. So I'm working on do you have an approach for that structure based on the content, or it's purely like subject heading, or like there is a mission or a vision behind a specific structure?
Well, in creating the structure, I think we started from both ends. First of all, working through kind of various already existing practices, metadata schemas, and collecting it, but actually also coming from the other side of what the material demands, because also for us it was important that it would be somehow possible to integrate it with existing systems in Estonia. But in many cases, the existing systems of digital archives that we have here would limit the possibilities for metadata are so limited that in order for scholars really to manage to work with Lotman's archive in any productive way, they won't be efficient enough. So in this sense, I think this creating the structure was moving back and forth between exactly what already exists in this metadata schemas and in the archival structures, and what the material itself describes or demands from us.
Can I share my struggle, at least my project struggle with, and I would like to know your insight, because I like this, working from both ends. I never thought about it. So I'm working on developing an archive for Palestinian childhood during the British Mandate. and there's no example like working with like archive of children in general, and it's really hard to conceptualize the relationship between, like, for general public, between water and childhood, between railway and childhood. So the vision of the archive is that to show the different aspect of that impacted childhood at that time. But that is the structure that I want to develop for the archive, which is, it's the way I'm looking at childhood, but the idea and the content is based on it. But I'm finding it really hard to convey it in a simple way. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, because, well, the topic, it's very, in itself, very complex and very intriguing, right? So I can imagine the struggle of finding a suitable framework that can encompass this. But as you said, if the existing possibilities, if you find that the material you're working with does not fit it, then it's actually a very Lotmanian way to approach that, you know, the material dictates the theory, and that's the way it should work. But can I ask, are you developing a digital archive or just organizing an analog one?
No, actually, there's no, because Palestinians don't own their data. It's everybody, colonizer, have owned their data. So I'm looking at 72 archive to bring in identifying all of these infrastructure. And then I'm interviewing people who are above 80 that experience part of their childhood. So I'm putting two things together and then creating subject heading, but conceptualizing it, which is developing non-traditional concept of Palestinian childhood infrastructure, that's the framework that I'm working on.
Well, it sounds very an amazing project. I definitely hope that you will manage to find your way through this and develop it into.
Thank you. No, I think I attended few sessions, not with this group. I think you're the only one who said you should work with both ends, so I'm intrigued. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the next question goes to John Goodyear.
Thank you very much. I'm bombarding you with questions, but I can't emphasize enough how much I'm enjoying this this workshop. Merit, in the course of your presentation, which just like Gerben's, of an outstanding quality, so thank you very much on that front. You mentioned about reaching out to Lotman's contacts or individuals who knew of him. I'm generally interested in this sort of user engagement aspect of this archival work. Could you tell us a little bit about how you went about this? Was this also a kind of a digital project? Did you use digital platforms, or was it, you know, it's sort of contacts that people know in the university space, and it was done through that way? So a little bit about user engagement and bringing those people into this project.
Yeah, I think actually it has been a very contradictive or a difficult aspect in our archival work, because it's usually not the job of archivists to, when creating this kind of description, to already start actually researching the materials and finding like answers. But one of the reasons behind it, why we also maybe differed a bit from the Tartu side here, is that all the people working with the archive are actually first researchers of Lotman and not archivists. But the reason why we decided, and we were criticized, let's say, from that this approach takes a lot of time and it's a very slow moving pace, and it definitely slowed down organizing the archive. But our reason behind this decision was that currently many colleagues of Lotman are still alive, and it won't be probably the case in, let's say, 10, 15 years. And at the moment, we can still find answers to questions that future researchers probably maybe will never answer then. So that's why we decided to take this time. Another thing that made this easy for us was that one of our main researchers in the archive was the personal secretary of Juri Lotman. So she can identify, she was reading his letters, writing letters on his behalf when he was already quite old and ill and couldn't manage to do it himself. So he knows all the handwritings, knows who to contact. So we had like inside access to all the people. And this Tartu Lotman circle, although many of the colleagues, of course, have already passed away, but also his students form a community that, despite being scattered all around the world at the moment, they still maintain contact. So even if we don't know someone, then somebody can already point us further on so we can find the right people to give us the information we need. So yes, it has been in a way a bit of unorthodox thing to do with an archive, but this has been our approach.
Thank you.
Thank you. I currently don't see any more hands, so I think we can be as punctual as we have described already in our schedule. So now it's time again for a brief break, and let's reconvene 15 past again after stretching our legs a bit, and then we will continue with the discussion together with Merit and Gerben. Thank you. I think we can gradually continue our workshop with the panel discussion, and I just wanted to make sure that I can see that Merit is here, and I wanted to make sure that Gerben is also back from stretching the legs. Hi.
He is very much back from stretching the legs.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much to both of you for these excellent presentations, and I'm kind of like very pleasantly surprised how actually your approach is coming from perhaps from the bird's eye with Gerben and from the concrete task of digitizing the Juri Lotman archive with Merit, how they actually really talk about the same things from different perspectives. And I'm kind of like super excited about this workshop because of this kind of like these connections and so on. So now we will have the next 45 minutes for discussion. I have prepared some questions with which I will try to bring these two excellent papers together. And at some point, I will also open the floor for the audience. And of course, if you have any pressing questions or anything, just I think that it's kind of like we can act in quite unofficial way, so that if somebody wants to jump in and has a related question, please go ahead and just raise your hand or write to the chat. So, but my first question is, although you both kind of like talk about to a certain extent the differences between a digital archive and a non-digital archive, and kind of like Merit, you have these kind of excellent examples of kind of like what are the different structures, and also Gerben, you were also having this analog between kind of like the analog and digital ways of creating archives, and so I was just wondering if you would could somehow continue on this and to discuss a little bit more, what do you think are the kind of like the main and the core differences between the digital and non-digital archives, and how do you see that these differences may affect on or have an impact on the way we study or the way we see the past? Like Gerben, you had this, you mentioned that there were some studies that perhaps younger generations of historians are more keen to use some keyword searches, and that might give a different kind of angle on what they find about the past, perhaps, or maybe you don't agree with this, but yeah, so what do you think? I don't know, who wants to start?
Well, I can just maybe start, and then Gerben can come in as well. I think that one important aspect that that I didn't manage to mention, and that I didn't also maybe heard so much before, was this from the user perspective of how you use archive, is this temporal and spatial presence of using the archive, of exactly also maybe how much time is needed if you work in the physical archive. Exactly what Gerben actually also mentioned, of like looking through the files and just reading and being with the material, experiencing also the kind of, because often archives are in very special atmosphere, or actually in historical sites, right? So all of this affects how we interact with the past. And I think it's not only about digital archives, but in digital culture generally, this speed of that we are used to of getting information, and how it's even already unthinkable for, exactly, I think, for the younger generation of doing this very traditional archival work. But some important aspects are lost also in relation to how archival discoveries are made. And it's a very common thing that actually most interesting cases are those discoveries in archives that where you find something that's in the file that should not be there, exactly by looking through just these boxes and folders. And this is something that in digital archive it can happen, but in a very different way. And exactly, you're searching for very concrete things already, and this serendipity of discovery is lost. I don't know, maybe Gerben wants to add something.
No, but you also showed, I think, very nicely how you can also promote a new kind of serendipity by interlinking materials in the digital archive in a way that does not exist in the analog archive. I think your presentation showed that quite nicely. So it might also be, just as we're talking about different materialities of the analog and the digital archive, we're also talking maybe about different serendipities. In that sense, which I find quite interesting. But for me, I think the big difference with working is indeed in the browsing and in the old-fashioned way of working in an archive. It might mean that you spend 3 days in an archive and you don't really find anything, because that's how it is. Yes, sometimes you're looking for a needle in a haystack and you won't find that needle. And hopefully you do. But there's also something about, I mean, there is a sort of trade-off in terms of the scale of the amount of material that you deal with, where obviously if you're dealing with a digitized archive, you have so much material that being able to immediately get to concrete search results is of course great. But then you need to zoom out, as it were, to get an idea of the bigger context, and often that zooming out does not necessarily take place. My favorite example is always the working with newspaper archive. So, for instance, I spent many weeks working with microfilmed Yiddish newspapers when I wrote my dissertation, looking for articles on a specific topic. In this case, I was working on Jewish volunteers who fought in the international brigades. But by browsing through that newspaper and going through those microfilms, I got a very, very good idea of what those newspapers were discussing in general and how the particular topic that I was interested in sort of fit within the overall coverage of that newspaper. And if you do newspaper research, this is absolutely essential if you only isolate the topic that you're interested in, you don't really understand a lot of what is going on. So the question is if you can sort of reproduce that in a digital sense. And of course, now with certain methods of topic modeling, you can actually start looking at how, let's say, particular topics relate to other ones within an overall corpus. But that is still not exactly the same as the sense of context and awareness you get when you do that manually, and especially if you have thousands and thousands of hits and search results, and the interface transports you immediately to the article level, so to the micro level, then the temptation to not pay too much attention to the zooming out to the more macro level is of course very big. And traditional research works the other way. You move from the macro to the micro. And now, of course, there are experiments with interfaces where you can sort of promote, let's say, that zooming in and out and going from distant to close reading and vice versa. So there are many ways of doing that. But that is something that we really need to think about. And that doesn't mean that it's per se bad, of course, that you go to the micro level immediately and you sort of skip that macro level, but you do need to think about ways to make sure that as researchers or students are aware of the fact that this is happening and how it differs from, let's say, traditional research. So in the end, it's all about raising awareness about those issues, so that you can take that into account when you do the research. I think that is the critical thing.
Yeah, I really like the way how you both kind of like address that there are these different types of contextualization, and it's and perhaps we could think that it is it is not necessarily that something is better than other, but we just need to be aware of those different ways of contextualization. Well, for instance, if I go to an archive, I as you explain, I will find similar documents that are in the same file, but I might lose those kinds of contextual factors that if I imagine a kind of like an interface of Juri Lotman's archive where I could pinpoint in a map or see in a map how many persons or how many letters he received from Bologna, for instance, or and that perhaps brings another kind of contextualization. So I think that this leads perhaps to my next question concerning the interfaces. Merit, you said that you didn't explicitly want to address this issue in your presentation because of the kind of like where your work is currently focusing on. But as you know, next week our project is going to organize a hands-on workshop where we are going to address the questions of user interface and how to actually create this kind of like how to create a good user interface, whatever that means, to our digitized archive, and what kinds of questions users might have there. So kind of like taking into account this kind of like different ways of using digital archives and interacting with them, do you have some preliminary thoughts or experiences of using some digital interfaces and kind of like some hints what we should actually talk about and think about next week as we are going to brainstorm about this?
I would actually, so we had a project in Luxembourg, it's called Impresso. It's a digital newspaper archive consisting of Luxembourgish and Swiss newspapers. It's actually now in the second phase of the project, and it also involves radio archives and many more resources. But in the first phase, the goal of the project was to create an interface for those digital newspapers and provide new ways to provide insights into the overall collection. And the colleagues ran a couple of workshops together with historians to figure out how do historians work with such a digital newspaper archive? What would they like to get out of it? So what are the questions that they would ask? What are the sort of questions that they would somehow like to see translated in the interface? And that all fed into the building of the interface, into the sort of visualizations, for example, of the years that the newspaper archive covered, and all kinds of other little things. And eventually, I think they also integrated more recently a sort of topic modeling approach within that newspaper archive. But the key point here is that it was co-constructed with users, with historians, and actually really where the colleagues really try to figure out, like, how are the users going to work with this? What are the needs that we need to cater to there? And I think that was incredibly useful and helpful. And with the archive, of course, it's a different question if you're dealing with a national digital archive or something. But with something like the Lotman archive, that is exactly the type of archive where such an approach is very feasible and makes a lot of sense to experiment with. So that would definitely be my suggestion, to perhaps also organize workshops where you really sit together with potential users and try to figure out what would they like to get out of the archive and how can we somehow feed that into the development of the interface.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think it's a very good idea. And in a way, actually, for this workshop, we have already invited also some not only people who are actually working with digital archives or know something about archiving, but exactly researchers who work with Lotman. So hopefully we will manage to get some insight. But I think in the same line that one of the questions that we have to ask is, like, who are this target audience? Like, how many different model users can we actually accommodate and add to this platform? Because being European financed project, of course, the kind of keywords are that it should be very widely accessible and for as many users as possible. And while it is a good aim in itself, we should actually also realistically think that does it make sense to assume that, you know, everybody will be interested in Lotman's archives, or how much can we engage this wider public? Or should we then already more narrowly focus on maybe at least engaging some schools or students to learn something, maybe not about Lotman per se, but about this historical context or semiotics more generally, but also not to lose our focus of still that its primary value is still serving researchers probably who want to work with this scientific legacy. But yes, I agree of thinking through and modeling this user trajectories on our platform is probably very, very, very relevant.
Yeah, I think also that I think that the idea of involving the potential users is a good way to go. And but at the same time, of course, we can never know who will be actually interested in using these materials, and also for what kind of research questions. Perhaps somebody who is not particularly interested in semiotics, but perhaps uses this archive for different kinds of research questions. And of course, we don't know about that, but it would be, of course, very interesting to, include also these kinds of people in the workshop, if that would be possible, and to be open to these kind of uses of the archive.
Can I comment briefly? No, just of these different research questions. I think in developing this archive, we have had very good examples of all of my colleagues actually have background in Russian philology, and I'm the only semiotician. So already in actually creating this structure of the archive, or how we describe it, we have had so many of these not fights, but discussions over of what is more important in the material, or you understand how much your disciplinary background affects already your view of what is relevant in the archive. So exactly, the more we manage to, because Lotman is a very interdisciplinary researcher and is relevant for or can be used in very different fields. So exactly, having this all sides represented behind the table is something we should keep in mind, definitely.
Yeah, that's right. I will now, if there are any questions from the audience, I kind of like encourage you to ask also, and while you are thinking about pressing questions, I actually have another thing that I have been thinking about this for a while, and but I think that it also came to my mind, especially when Merit, you were talking, especially about the question about when we digitize archival materials and archival collections, we kind of there is a thinking that we somehow try to transmit the inherent features of these materials into digital format, although of course a digitized version of a newspaper or a document is not the actual original version. It's a digital interpretation of that. And of course, now that we are living in the world of artificial intelligence, and I think that there are more and more increasingly these kinds of like discussions about authenticity in general in our culture, and also discussions about reliability of information, and we all know about fake historical narratives that are circulating around, and so on. So with this in this kind of like future vision of kind of like perhaps increasing importance and the discussions of authenticity, and if we think about that, when we transmit an archival document into digital format, nevertheless we create some kind of like a interpretation of that in a different format. So do you have any thoughts or advice, perhaps? How do you think that we should start to think about this originality in digital format? And is there a way to establish kind of like, I don't know, a watermark of originality of a digital copy, or is that totally impossible? And how does that affect on kind of like our thinking of authenticity of historical sources?
Well, I personally am not too aware of these technological approaches, but I know that there are ways how to exactly not maybe like watermark metaphorically the original document. So in archival practices, it is probably possible to ensure this authenticity, but then again, how digital content, the kind of afterlife or the life outside of archive, or how this history that we digitize, how it starts living its own life outside of this curated archive. This is already a completely different question. And of course, on one side, there is this more positive aspect of being allowing a completely new side of cultural creativity, of mixing these materials into new contexts and interpreting them in this way. And on the other side, especially on the kind of historical manipulation of archival document, there can be some quite malicious practices as well. And thinking through how to fight against it, or how to kind of ensure authenticity, I think on the archival side is a very complicated topic. My own thoughts have always been more on the side of how to develop critical literacy skills in more in our society, in order to deal with this malicious practices of information manipulation and etc. So, but on the archival side of what we can do here, I'm definitely not an expert.
I have to confess that that applies to me as well. But I think I very much wanted to would concur with the idea of the digital literacy and how important it is to work on those skills, not only in the case of students in the humanities, but in general in schools. At the same time, there's also, of course, the question how much consumption of history takes place through a digital archive, and how much takes place outside that realm. And of course, most kids these days might first encounter history through games that they're playing. And if they Google, they might encounter something on Wikipedia. They look at YouTube channels. Nowadays on TikTok, things are going around. So there's a whole range of mediations of history that have nothing to do with our work, that somehow professional historians need to find a way to engage with. And now suddenly everything is again sort of accelerating in this age of AI in the last 1-2 years, where no one really knows where this is going to end, except that we have very little control, of course, over how indeed digital archival content might be reused in certain ways. So it's a very difficult question, I think, to answer in general, also because things seem to be again so much in flux now. But I think the literacy aspect is probably the most critical to further develop and focus on.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, good points. We have 2 questions in the chat. First one is from Petri Paju, who is asking or writing that I have understood that Juri Lotman worked in many languages, and certainly in some that were quite unfamiliar to me. Is this perhaps providing translation something that you could try to help with in digital archive or interface?
Yes, actually, I think that at least I hope that this will be one of the main benefits of having this digital archive as well, that we will be able to create this automated translation while already working with the documents. And actually the level of AI translations at the moment is already so good that it might be even sufficient for researchers exactly of working with this automated translations. Because at the moment, very often we get researchers in the archive who also, they don't speak Russian, and most of the materials are in Russian, and who need a lot of assistance that we are just physically not able to provide, of like sitting side by side and reading them or translating the materials. So in this sense, it would be very beneficial. And actually, my own experience has been that even very simple tools that exist already, like Google Lens, for example, even this kind of free app can manage to read handwritten documents and translate it. And of course, the level of accuracy is not always 100%, but it still works. And so hopefully, yes, to Petri, that this will be possible in our archive as well.
Yeah, that's good. And I think you actually also responded to Anne Kauppala's question about, because she was also asking about this translation and whether there will be automatic online translation available, for example, especially on Russian materials. So, or do you want to add something more to this particular question still? Yeah. Yeah, I was actually thinking when regarding this discussion on automated translation, do you think that these tools, especially automated translation or other perhaps other tools that are available right now or will be soon, do you think that they will help us to conduct more transnational research? Is there a way to kind of like, you know, as you were also mentioning this, how digitization in a way, although it creates obstacles, but it also creates an easier way to access materials from other parts of the world, provided that you have an internet connection and so on. But do you see that there are also some possibilities opening for these kinds of like transnational studies and well, of course, Gerben, you have also addressed these problems of kind of like southern. I think it was really nicely put, like southern materials in the north and northern materials in the south, or something along those lines. So yeah, what are your thoughts about the possibilities of transnationality?
I think it opens up a lot of possibilities for transnational. It's very contextual. So in the case of if you would talk about a global north-south context, there's a bit the question, of course, like what could be accessed by whom, and what kind of how do those modalities work out. But of course there are many examples of people who have been able to do the kind of research that even 10 years ago were not possible. If I look at my own work, I once wrote a book chapter on the basis of Yiddish newspapers that were part of the Lithuanian holdings of the Lithuanian National Library, and it was basically a biographical research, and I was looking at trial reports in Yiddish newspapers, and I could never have written that without that was essential material for me. So that was completely crucial. And I have other examples of working with newspapers where the fact that I could actually online work with certain newspapers and search through them added a dimension that I could not have added in let's say an analog context, or only with much more trouble and especially time investment. And this, by the way, also applies for the translation aspect. I've also worked with Polish materials that I couldn't read, but I needed to figure out something about how the resonance of a certain, let's say, how something resonated also in the Polish press in the 1930s during the Spanish Civil War, and I was able to use translation software to figure some of those questions out. This was 8 years ago, and when I used the translation eventually in my book, I still ran it by a Polish colleague to make sure that the translation was really correct and that I really had understood it correctly. But we've come so far in the last couple of years with that type of technology, that now I would probably take the risk of publishing a quote based on a machine translation. So in that sense, the affordances are of course manifold. That's beyond doubt. That's very clear. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. But Meri, do you want to add something?
I actually started thinking further about what Gerben said with this using automated translation, and what Hannu now wrote about AI possibilities, not only for translating, but also for summarizing. And I think that while, for example, translation aspect is on a very, very good level, then this summarizing aspect is much more problematic. And I've also thought about it in the context of Lotman's archive. If, for example, I don't know, an AI would have all our materials, and you would ask something about, like, how did Lotman understand the concept of, I don't know, semiosphere? The problem is that Lotman, in his writings on different time periods and in different texts, can be quite controversial. He was very flexible with using different notions. So if you search for like strict definitions for any concept that he writes, you can find 50 of them for any notion. So how would AI would probably try to give some generalized thing of it, or kind of give a very concrete and nice and rounded up definition. But and sometimes it's useful enough for example, if you're learning about Lotman, or if you're learning about semiotics, that's enough. But if you're researching and then relying primarily not on original texts, but already on these summaries that AI provides, here it can become quite problematic. But at the same time, AI is so convenient, and so exactly it's so easy and so yeah, exactly convenient to use it, that it's hard to resist sometimes. This.
I think one of the challenges with AI is also going to become, I mean, one thing we actually discussed that this week during a little internal training in Luxembourg, where we are actually looking at named entity recognition and trying to do some, trying to visualize networks in historical documents. And those are, of course, wonderful new possibilities, and especially the realm of data extraction. You can do things in minutes that would have taken you, I don't know, a day with regular expressions and things like that to figure out. So this is wonderful. And at the same time, you start running into the question at the moment, how you can create your own corpus of materials that you don't necessarily feed into ChatGPT. So how do you keep your own corpus private on your own computer or on a server with enough computing power to work with that? And I think a lot of people are now simultaneously trying to figure out solutions for that. But once that is a little bit more clear, and once I think we're still very much in a sort of experimental phase where a lot of people are trying to figure out those things. And once that settles in a little bit more, maybe even within 1 or 2 years, then it becomes very interesting to see how historians more generally would start using AI indeed for summarizing, for developing a sort of chat assistant, as Hannu is suggesting. And I can see many very interesting uses there, especially now that AIs also start to the reasoning that is now also being integrated into AI systems, where you can actually see why you get a certain answer. That also changes already a lot. It suddenly makes things transparent that until a month or 2 months ago were much less transparent. So it's moving so fast that it is, yeah, it's difficult to see where that is going to end. But I think eventually it will change our research quite a lot in different ways.
That's true. Yeah. I can see that we have several questions in the chat. Henry Suominen is asking, how does the Internet Archive fit into this, or does it at all? Is there a plan to make the data available on this platform as well? the research of Internet Archive is already quite mainstream, so a broader audience would be able to at least stumble upon it. Of course, it would require more effort to maintain this side of archival too. I believe this is a question to Merit particularly, but if Gerben, you want to address this as well, you can do that. But
we have considered this, and it, if possible, at least at some stage of the project, it would be a very nice addition. It isn't in the kind of main plan of this prototype that we're building at the moment, exactly because the prototype still only kind of we have this plan for this main part, but then in additional or in future research, this is something definitely to consider and that we have discussed. But yes, I agree that it's also needs this continuous input, and in this sense is from the archival side additional work, but it would be valuable for the project.
Yes. Is there something, Gerben, that you would like to add here in this?
No, I think that is quite complete.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
yes, good. There is another question. There is a question from Anne Kauppila, who asks about, if Merit, you could give a brief description of how we are going to bridge Lotman and ECHO's archives in a practical level.
Well, this here, Mila and Hannu, you're welcome to step in as well, because I'm on the same level of information as you are. But as much as we have described the idea is that, or discussed the idea, then our understanding is that when building a scholarly archive, especially of humanities scholars, and Lotman and ECHO still are close in their research, the challenges and the practices, they have a lot of this overlapping. So if we can, based on now building this Lotman archive, develop some more general guidelines of what to consider, how to approach, what are these main processual events that you have to go through, then this can later on work as a framework where we can start adding various scholarly archives from the world. So, and exactly the next step will be try to see how this, what we have developed, works on ECHO's material. This will allow us to kind of refine our guidelines to see what works on this different material, what not, and then further on already present it as a framework that other archives can use. So this is how I have kind of understood our plans so far, but of course there are some loose ends on our side. I don't know if you want to comment, Mila or Hannu, or
Hannu, please. I can see that you have.
Not really, but I guess the idea was first to have a prototype in a way to see how it works. But I guess it's so, if there's someone from Bologna here, the stage of the archive is different in a sense that there are different copyright issues. So this doesn't mean that they will be twinned forever at this point, but like more like a prototype that can be used in other contexts as well, as Merit said.
Yes. We have one more question. I think this is the last question that we can have because we are approaching the end of our time. But the last question is from Robert Parnica, who is asking or writing that I would like to hear from Merit and Gerben on how archivists make sense of archival collections in digital environment by enriching digital archives with useful digital tools based on contextual and content metadata, creating rich interactive representations much beyond digital surrogates. I think this is a potential for both users and archivists. Any thoughts on this?
I am not sure if I completely understand the question here. I think he is asking how archivists themselves enrich digital archives with digital tools, or how they could do that. Maybe Robert could confirm that I understood the question correctly.
Yes, Gerben, you are correct. Actually, that was my initial thought.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for your
Yeah, it's difficult for me to say because I'm not an archivist. So I don't know what kind of tools you might be thinking about, or if you have examples already from your own practice.
All right, can I just have a minute to explain?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mila. I
Yes.
just wondering, because we, as an archivist, we do produce quite a lot of metadata. We have a contextual metadata, we have a textual metadata, we have a context metadata, and I'm wondering if these metadata can be visualized, they can be added to the digital archives, creating additional access point to our digital surrogates. And I think something that I haven't heard from today's workshop, because I think that could be a potential for us archivists to make more interactive dialogue with our researchers, and also our researchers can have more, interesting access point to the digital surrogates, and actually to the knowledge that the archivists present in a way through metadata. I'm sorry if it's too long to explain.
No, it's very clear. Thanks a lot for clarifying. So if I understand this correctly, it links a little bit to the example that I gave of the Impresso interface, the newspaper interface, where they basically tried to use effectively metadata to provide new insights, overall insight in the collection. And I know that at least some audiovisual archives, the one in the Netherlands, has also experimented with using all metadata to give a sort of meta view as well of the collection, of what is actually inside the collection, as a complement to, of course, offering the digital material itself. Those are actually two examples that come to mind. And I would suspect that there are many archives that are probably nowadays that really try to experiment with using that type of information and metadata to sort of visualize what is inside collections. But maybe, I don't know, Merit, maybe you might know something about this as well.
Well, I guess quite a common example is exactly this putting archival items on a map, or exactly providing this geographical presentation of information. And there have been some good examples. One of my colleagues usually brings is this, that in Great Britain they made this archive of films, of old film archive that nobody wanted to actually really use, or there was very little interaction. But as soon as they figured out that we can generate this view for users, that they can see certain like movie scenes in real life geographical locations, it became hugely popular immediately, because it gave this entrance point to relate to these materials in the archive through this geographical location, and added, completely different level of value for the materials. So something like that, and this is something that we definitely are considering, exactly these various entry points to the material in building of our archive as well.
Yes, thank you. I'm afraid we have reached the end time of our workshop. I really would like to thank all the participants in this both the presentations and the discussion. At least I have learned a lot, and my notebook is full of notes. So it's good to start weekend from here. So thank you all. And if you are interested in the next sessions of our or the next workshops, please go to DIGHT-Net website and register for the next sessions. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Much point.